you. We'll go on with the planning committee, and the first thing on the agenda is apologies. Any apologies, please, James?
Chair, we've had apologies from Councillor Everett and Councillor Thomas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Declarations of interest, anyone? No, we're all happy, thank you. Minutes of our last meeting, those here, do a quick record. Thank you. We move on to the planning applications. We've got two today. The first one is 4A Freestraw Lane, that's Clover Hill, and I'll ask for planner to take us through the report, please, Kevin.
Thank you, Chair. So the application before you today is a reserve matters application for the erection of 76 dwellings and associated works, and the erection of a construction compound in connection with an area outline application at Bowthorpe to the west of the city. The site is a site allocation, and it has the benefit of outline consent. A wider site has the benefit of outline consent for up to 1,000 homes, including affordable housing, a care home, a new village centre, including at least one shop, public open space and associated roads and infrastructure. So this is one phase as part of that overall development. It's an application by Norwich City Council on land that it owns, and it's for the approval of details that were reserved for future determination as part of that original outline planning consent. So the location plan shows you the extent of what is known as phase 3. So it's a triangle of land and then a separate but linked rectangle of land beneath it. Better seen in the wider context here of, so here's phase 3 as it's called, and you can just about see the blue extent, wider extent there of the land that is currently in the ownership of Norwich City Council, and a large extent of that is covered by the outline consent. What this plan also shows is we have down here what's called Spine Road within your report, or Saxon Coat Avenue. Across the top here is Earlham Green Lane, which is a footway cycleway, which takes you down to the district centre where there are some shops, health centre. You have Bowthorpe Hall on the edge of the plan here. We've got the River Yare and the River Valley at the bottom of the slide. There's existing residential development of 3 down here, and Clover Hill to the north, and West Earlham. And you can just about see on here earlier phases of the outline consent that have already been constructed. Phase 2 was residential development, and also there's a care home. If we move on, just look at that in the context of an aerial photograph view. So this triangle here is the application site we're dealing with today. What there is that separates that from wider undeveloped land is there's a belt of trees that sort of continues up through Bowthorpe and connects into Bunkers Wood here. You can see the Spine Road there, the earlier phases of development, including the care village. So, in dealing with the reserve matters application, you need to look and refer to high-level plans that were approved at outline stage. So one of those plans is, there was an outline parameters plan, and this sets out the principles or parameters that each of the phases should follow. So you can see this is the extent of the outline application essentially. The application site is up at the top here in this triangle. But you can see the dark blue is the Spine Road and the bus lane here. The grey is what's called development parcels, and then there's shown to be a hierarchy of streets, which are these paler blue and yellow areas of open space, which are the green areas. So in relation to the phase that we're looking at today, basically the triangle of land includes some streets, some development blocks, and an area of open space, and a connection into existing green infrastructure on Erlen Green Lane and abuts the tree belt. Another plan from the outline application was a green infrastructure plan. Again, here is the application site. It shows the open space, which is classed there as a village green type open space. And it shows these green dashed lines are various types of green links, green infrastructure. So linkages into Erlen Green Lane, and there's a buffer, natural buffer provision to the existing green infrastructure. And the idea being that it all links through subsequent phases down into the river valley and into existing green infrastructure and woodland that exists in the area. So the application that we have, the reserve matters for this submission, this is the master plan that has been provided by the applicant. So points of reference back to those earlier plans. Here is Saxon Coat Avenue on the Spine Road. Here's the tree belt along the south of the site. And here's Erlen Green Lane, which is an existing footway cycleway. And they basically are the sort of they surround the site, and it's a parcel of land within that. The triangle of land sits at the top of the hill. The layout proposed shows one single point of access onto Saxon Coat Avenue, and then there's a hierarchy of streets. So that are all basically, there's no through road into other existing development, but there's a hierarchy of cul-de-sacs, different types of paving there as you get into private drives. You've got an area of open space at the top here, which is the village green that was on those plans. There's also a pocket park in the centre of the development, and also sort of buffer green space alongside Erlen Green Lane and alongside the tree belt. Sorry, jumped too far ahead there. The proposal is for, like I said, 76 dwellings, which is a combination of, there are 9 flats at the top here, and then a combination of terraced and semi-detached properties, providing a whole range through 1 beds through to 4 beds, over 2 to 3 storey properties. All of the dwellings meet the amenity space standards, and not all of them have access to external space, including the flats which all have an external balcony. The properties along here face onto Saxon Coat Avenue, but they don't have access directly from Saxon Coat Avenue, which led to some sort of issues about how to deal with the layout in that area of the site, which I'll come on to shortly. Of those 76 dwellings, 52 of them are affordable dwellings and 24 are market. The market are mainly arranged around the bottom part of the site. Parking is provided mainly on plot, with a few exceptions to that. There's a parking area for the flats adjacent, and then there are these two small parking courts, which are necessitated because of the properties that their parking serves not having direct access from Saxon Coat Avenue. So basically you drive into a parking court, and these properties will park in this area, and these properties at the top will park in this area. Between them is a pedestrian and cycle link, so you can't drive between the two, they're essentially sort of cul-de-sacs. There are numerous pedestrian and cycle links through the site, so you can come through the pocket park, you can come off the road at various points onto Erlen Green Lane, and you can also come into the bottom of the site there and run along the bottom of the site through onto Erlen Green Lane. You can see it's a less dense layout than the existing phases, which are on the east side of Saxon Coat Avenue. What does that look like on the ground? So we've got a couple of street scenes here. The top one is the view as you're travelling up Saxon Coat Avenue, and the bottom one is the properties that will face onto the tree belt. So you can see there are a variety of 2 and 3 storey properties. The top of the hill are the flats, which are 3 storey, and a variety of designs and materials are used. So just having a quick look at some of those house types. There are the plants, like I say, they're 3 stories. They're multi-elevational, so the front elevation is at the top there, that will look out over the open space. Similar for the 2 sides, and then the rear elevation is effectively a sort of a corridor to access the properties, but it still has numerous windows in it that will look south across the car park. You can see the balconies there and lots of fenestration. Then there's sort of 3-storey terrace types. There's all sorts of variety in terms of brick types, mixture. This one has got vertical composite cladding boarding. And there's the use of balconies there as well. Another 3 and 2-storey terrace here with a mixture of brick types. And a 2-storey example, 2-bed 2-storey example. So what does that look like in the area? These are very similar house types to what exists. So let's have a look at a few existing houses that have been built on in the earlier phases to see what that might look like rather than just on a drawing. So you can see here the 3 and 2-storey properties sit well alongside each other. The 3-storey blocks in the foreground as well. Got variations in use of render, buff brick, red brick, quite a lot of hardwood surfacing around it, but also interspersed with landscaping. These are the examples of the use of the vertical boarding and the balconies. So the boarding on the same property with use of brickwork as well. These are examples of those 2-storey sort of shallower roofed properties with a mixture of rendering and different brick types in the same street. And there again, you've got a flat development now on the corner that sort of turns the corner interspersed with other rendered and brick properties. And there are the vertical bordered properties as well, seen from the rear. So moving on to some illustrative aerial images that the applicant has provided to see how that might look alongside the existing development. So this is existing built development. That is a true aerial photograph taken by a drone, I assume. And you can see the existing housing to the north. And then this is 3D illustration, see how it will show you how it will look. So there's the access point that I talked about into the development. Here's it's a slightly dated, it hasn't been updated to the latest layout, but here's the one of those parking courts, which looks slightly different now. The other parking court, flat at the top, green space, pocket parking here. You see how these properties face onto the open space. This is looking from the north, so you've got that northern village green area of open space. These are existing properties on phase 2. So this is the new flats that I talked about, and looking down the hill, so you've got a mixture of 2 and 3-storey properties looking down into the river valley. And this is looking west, so this is a little bit earlier when the dwellings were under construction in those earlier phases. You can see across, there's a linkage through there, the pocket park, and then the cluster of housing around it. You can see how everything sort of looks across these green spaces, the parking areas and the flats. But a few more illustrations. This is how, from the existing development looking across Saxon Coat Way, where those people are walking down there, and a path that takes you into the development and the pocket park. And these are images of some of those properties that look out onto Earl Green Lane and the buffer green space there, use of balconies, on-plot parking. These ones have got integral garages to them. That pocket park area is sort of central to the development and is surrounded by development. It's showing how linkages will come through the pocket park. There'll be use of informal play within there. You can just see the back of the flats there. Another image showing the pathways through it, and these are the backs of the properties on Saxon Coat Avenue. Looking south, the backs of the properties on Saxon Coat Avenue. You can see how this space is well overlooked by properties that have an entrance onto that space, and also upper windows of upper floors of similar dwellings. And then that's just the other perspective, sort of looking out to the west. This is what the flats would look like at the top of the site, the 3-storey flats, and the balconies looking out and having a good surveillance of the open space. And this is sort of standing out on Saxon Coat Avenue. You've got the existing development on the left, and then that's how the flats would look and the open space would look on the right. And this is what it looks like in reality today. So these are the flats that are already there as part of the early phase, and this is the application site. So this would be part of the green space at the top of the site.
Sorry, so that's right.
So this is part of the green space at the top of the site, and in the distance you can just see the flags and the sort of silos of the existing builders compound. So similar view, but this is the open space at the top. You can see there's existing trees within there that will be retained and utilised. This is Green Lane that I made reference to a number of times. This is a footway, cycleway, a little bit overgrown at that point, but you see it's a lot of natural vegetation down there, trees and scrub vegetation. This is looking northwards up Saxon Coat Avenue, so the earlier phases were just nearing completion at that time. The application site is on the left, and just a little bit further down the hill, you can see how as the road extends through the tree belt there, you can see the existing houses on the right, and the application site will be on the left. And this is what a lot of the site looks like. It's scrub vegetation, would have been grass on at one time, becoming quite overgrown, and there are, in parts of the site, there are a number of trees of various ages. This is looking towards the woodland tree belt at the south, but the majority of the site looks like that, and there's the builder's compound, existing construction compound. Here's a landscaping plan, which I'll leave up and come back to as I just go into what the main issues were that were covered in the report in brief. So we've dealt with the reserved matters of access. I mentioned single point of access, it's a permeable layout for pedestrians and cyclists, parking arrangements that give at least one space per dwelling, and that has been increased through some revisions to the layout, which has seen the parking provision increased. In the report, I mentioned that mention is made of cycle path provision coming up Saxon Coat Avenue. It hasn't been considered necessary to provide that in carriageway because of the layout that is proposed and the cycle path provision for cyclists that's been made through the development that allows linkages through into existing cycling infrastructure and into and crossing into cycle provision on the other side of the road as well. So you can come up the hill on quieter streets off the main Saxon Coat Avenue. Layout, scale and external appearance, they are other reserve matters which I've sort of clustered together there, but basically what's proposed is an outward facing development, numerous linkages throughout the site to link open space and green infrastructure. There's varieties of the house types and the materials as I've shown on the slides, but familiarity there, sort of showing the connection with the earlier phases. The report discusses issues or concerns, let's say, that the design out crime and the highways officer had about rear parking court provision that I mentioned. But I think, as I've explained, that there is sufficient natural surveillance of those areas, and there will be active use of the areas through encouragement of walking through the pocket park to get through to other areas of the development, for there to be sufficient natural surveillance and active use for those concerns not to be become an issue, to become reality. I haven't really mentioned it much, but the construction compound is proposed at the south of the tree belt on similar sort of looking land to the photographs that I showed you. It's a necessity really of this development. The construction compound at the moment is within this phase. It has to move, unfortunately, south of the tree belt, but there is a planning condition to seek its removal once the phase is complete. And the final reserve matter is that of landscaping, and that is fundamental to making the layout a success. So there's sufficient provision of green space through the village green at the top of the site, through the pocket park in the centre of the site, and those buffer green space areas alongside the woodland belt and Elm Green Lane. And those some of those areas will include provision for seating, for litter bins, for Fido bins, etc., encouraging sort of active use of these areas. There is a recognised loss that's documented in the report of trees from the site. 52 trees will be lost. However, there will be some replacement provision. 58 new trees are proposed, including 17 of those are heavy standard trees. So what this plan here shows is there's a number of coloured dots, green being amenity tree provision, yellow being they're sort of more feature trees, and the blue being smaller trees or larger feature shrubs. So you can see that there's a sort of fair distribution of those trees across the site as a replacement provision. There's also proposed to be some biodiversity mitigation enhancement measures used, provision of bird and bat boxes, mainly in existing mature trees along Elm Green Lane, but also swift boxes will be provided within 20 swift boxes will be provided within the dwellings themselves. So, with this extensive landscaping scheme, provision of green space, including some buffer scrub areas for invertebrates, then together with on-site provision on other existing phases and future phases of development, and off-site wider provision to do with management of areas such as the Mole Pit, Bunkers Wood, and the river marshes, and some parkland restoration. If you take it in the context of this being an allocated site, a large area to be developed over a number of years, then the green infrastructure and biodiversity enhancement provision is considered to be acceptable. There's been no objections from residents or consultees to this application, and they're not considered to be any unacceptable impacts on amenity, living or working conditions of neighbouring occupiers or new occupants. So just in conclusion then, the principle of the development has been accepted already through the grant of outline approval, and the reserve matters that we're dealing with here looks at the detail of the development, and it's broadly in accordance with the high-level parameters that were established at outline planning permission stage. It's an acceptable layout, an acceptable amount of open space and landscaping and parking provision. There's provision of a significant level of affordable housing at 58%, which is well over the 33% required, and that's resulted in a recommendation to approve the application subject to the conditions that are listed on page 39 of your report. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, for that. Can I just remind members there is an update paper and there is one little piece at the top for this item. We'll move on to questions now to the planning to deal with any speakers. Can I ask one first, Sarah, please? The green spaces and the new trees and everything that we put into the site, can you tell me who's going to do the keep an eye on and who's going to pay for?
The initial provision will be made paid for by the developer. This plan here actually shows the management arrangements. So the purple areas are private areas, so people's gardens. The green areas are areas that would be dealt with by a management company. So there's an existing management company, is my understanding, for the earlier phases of development. So the management company, a new management company, or the management company will be extended to deal with the green areas of this this phase of the development as well. So it would be a management company that would deal with the majority of the larger trees.
Thank you. Any other questions, Councillor Maxwell?
Thank you, Lord Mayor. Speaking from the existing second floor flat, with electric cars coming in, are we going to put any charging stations in?
The submission does make reference to there being electric vehicle charging enabled. So I'm assuming there will be infrastructure provision across the site for future connection into it if needed.
Councillor Giles?
Thanks. My first point was in relation to police's representations about the permeability of the site and how that measured up against the signing out crime criteria. I know that could be an issue across both. And my second question was in relation to the management company. What are the governance arrangements and what resident input is there into the running of that management company?
So in relation to the police design and crime officer, I did have quite an extensive conversation with her. The concern surrounded the concern was that the site was too permeable, that you can get through the site in lots of ways, but that was part of the point of the layout, allowing sort of people to pass through the site to get to where they need to get to. They don't like the use of the rear parking courts, but it's a necessity in this case because of the access arrangements. And as long as it's got sufficient surveillance, which I think it does have, then that shouldn't become an issue. The issue that was raised as well was to do with the fact that the two parking courts were connected by a path, so allowing people to pass through there that might not otherwise need to be able to pass through there. But it should be seen in the same way, I think, as a street, with cars parked along it. People would pass through it, be expected to pass through it to get to the pocket park. It's not going to be a out of the way, forgotten areas, and people should be encouraged to pass through it. So it was sort of a little bit of sort of conflicting requirements really in terms of the police design and crime officer. We had a look to see whether there was any way of addressing that. I don't think it would help to sever the link between the two parking court areas because in other layout terms and in terms of how you pass through the site, that wouldn't help. So I think it's with sufficient surveillance, which I think there is, those areas they shouldn't become problematic. The question to do with the management company setup, I'm not able to answer that because I don't know what those arrangements are. That would be something that the applicant, I know there is an existing management company, and I imagine it would be set up along the same sorts of lines.
David?
Sorry, can I just come back on that? The detailed arrangements of the management company are not really something that the committee can get too involved with. The reason that the management company is an issue here is because there's green space that needs managing. We can't kind of dictate what level of involvement residents have in terms of whatever the management company is, I'm afraid.
Councillor Lovett?
Yes, on that subject, I think we are concerned about that in terms of will the management company have the resources to look after the green spaces? I mean, you say that the applicant will provide us green spaces, and then they walk away from it, do they? Or do they leave some money in the pot to look after those trees? Or does all the money come from the people who live there and the social, the rented people who rent? Do they pay or does the council pay on their behalf? I mean, there are issues here because if you have a situation like this in your ward, and I say I've had one going back over 10 years, and it's still not resolved that there are trees that are not being looked after, and we can't get to the bottom of why there isn't any money to look after the trees, because the developers say that they gave some money, and that's that, and they're not giving any more. It's terribly complicated, and as ward councillors, you know, you're often just in the dark about it completely. But if at this stage you're absolutely clear about who's got what responsibility and what resources there are, then, you know, 5 years down the line when they're built, you've got some answers for the residents. And I'm afraid I wasn't very good at that 10 years ago, and I haven't got any answers for the residents, and everybody's upset about it. So I do think, although we don't have any control over it, it would be nice to know about it.
Can I just come partly back to you on that in terms of what I know? I know from the earlier phases that there is a handover, so the developer would construct the development in accordance with the plans, including provision of the landscaping. And before the management company take on that open space provision or the landscaping that they would be responsible for, there is an audit carried out to make sure that it's done in accordance with those plans, that the trees are alive, and it's got the best start that it can have before the management company will take that on. And then in terms of the makeup of the management company, I'm not certain how that works, but generally it would be funded by a service charge from the people that occupy the dwellings, and that's how it would be funded.
Councillor Bergwijn. Councillor Lowy.
Can I just come back? And does that mean the affordable housing which is rented, do they in their rent pay for the service to that?
I mean, ultimately, that's a matter for the registered social provider to resolve, whether or not they pass it on directly, or whether whether they come to an arrangement with the landowner when they acquire the units. So I can't answer that question directly, but I mean, as Sarah said, there is a management company that is operating reasonably successfully in terms of the first phases of the development, and that arrangement will continue on these.
But they are taking on a lot more, and the majority of these properties are for social rent. We presumably would be the landlord, the City Council. Not necessarily?
Not necessarily, but I think in this instance we would be. This is the difficulty. You're granting planning permission for a land use at the end of the day. To a degree, who actually owns it is not particularly relevant. But from your point of view as decision makers on the planning application, it's whether or not the relevant material planning considerations are covered. And management companies are a fairly standard way of managing communal open spaces.
I'm sure that they are, but do they have the resources? If all these trees are then going to become part of their responsibility, and we've only got 25 homes that are going to be privately bought, and if you know, is there enough money to actually look after these green spaces? I mean, ultimately, if there isn't, so we get green spaces that are not fit for purpose, as it were.
But we will also, from a planning point of view, we will also have conditions on that require their maintenance. So, in terms of the planning issues, we have recourse to require them to we can enforce the conditions that are attached to it. I'm afraid, I understand your frustration, but we can't get involved in the detailed arrangements of how a management company is set up. That's not material to the decision-making process here today, I'm afraid.
Councillor Bergwijn.
So I've got a couple of interlinked questions, I think, around the loss of trees and the biodiversity net loss. So I understand that it has got outline planning permission with a consent that has acknowledged that there will be a biodiversity net loss and that they have done everything reasonable they can within the constraints of the site to mitigate for that loss. I also understand that there is some mitigation mitigation measures outside the site. So I would appreciate if you could go into a bit more detail. I personally obviously think that there should be biomass replacement on day one. So I was wondering if there is scope to have mitigation for loss of trees off-site to make that happen, as well as they've already have kind of mitigation measures to offset the biodiversity loss.
Yeah, so the wider off-site provision, and there's quite a significant amount of it, and if I go back to an earlier slide, it might give you some context. Apart from it's just frozen. So maybe not. But there was financial contributions through a Section 106 agreement to do with woodland enhancement at Bunkers Wood, which I think may have already taken place or partly been taken place. Some future phases will include some improvements down in the Ellen and Beauthorpe marshes. There's historic parkland restoration around Beauthorpe Hall, and some wildflower meadow planting in that area. And there was quite a bit of emphasis as well on green infrastructure through, pedestrian pathway provision as well, to allow people access to these areas. So it was monies, and obviously the City Council being landowner of lots of those areas as well, allowing those areas to be more effectively managed or become managed where they perhaps weren't. So in terms of the wider biodiversity enhancement provision, but it's quite an extensive area. You know, it's a large site, 1,000 dwellings on such a large site. Like I say, it was acknowledged in those early submissions that there wouldn't be a net gain, and a balance was struck. In the planning balance at the time, it was considered to be acceptable because of the provision of a substantial amount of housing. So, and it's in conjunction with the phases of development that will come forward as part of the overall outline planning consent include quite a significant number of areas of open space of varying functions, sort of formal and informal. So I think it like I say, I think it has gone as far as it can in terms of that biodiversity enhancement, also green infrastructure provision of spaces for people to use, new residents to use as well. In terms of the biomass loss, we did ask the applicant to go further, and they did produce a biomass biomass report, and it demonstrated that the replacement provision wouldn't on day one make the same provision, and in order to do that, you'd have to, well, not cover the site itself in trees, but have a lot more planting on the site itself, which you couldn't do and get the number of houses out of it. In terms of the provision, let's suppose what you're getting at is, can we get some replacement planting within those off-site enhancements? But they've already been set out within the legal agreement as part of the outline planning permission, so it's not possible, I would have thought, or not easily possible, to make that replacement provision other than sort of via the legal route. And I don't think at this stage, in the planning balance of the considerations of this application, it was considered that the balance was sufficient, that the principle has been accepted with that loss before.
But we couldn't have known in the outline the amount of loss of trees, so I think it's reasonable to ask to seriously consider whether there is a path to try and get at least some off-site compensation, now that we know that we're losing a considerable amount of trees.
Well, what would, at outline application stage, there would have been, there were ecology surveys, there would have been numerous reports that informed an assessment of the biodiversity value of the site at the time. what's happened in the intervening time is that was granted in 2012, 2013. This site would have been grassland. It now has some trees on it, just through natural self-seeded trees have been allowed to become, because it's not managed and it's allowed to become established. So the requirement of each phase is that it comes forward with an updated ecological survey and tree survey, so you capture what the situation is at that time and trying to provide that compensatory replacement. And there is replacement tree provision, but like say in terms of that biomass loss, it won't be an exact replacement straight away.
Well, Councillor Bunton and Councillor Grant.
Sorry, can I just come back on that, Chair? I think what you need to remember here is you're dealing with a reserve matters application on an outline permission that was granted back in 2012, and planning policy has moved on since then. However, you're still fettered by the original permission, and you're not looking at matters of principle. You're looking at those matters that were reserved for determination at a later date, which are the ones that Sarah has looked at. So, I mean, biodiversity net gain back in 2012 was not a thing. If it had been, it would have been addressed. Not a thing in terms of land use planning policy. If it had been, the outline application would have been determined in a very different way, and the principle of biodiversity net gain, because it is an issue of principle, would have been embodied in the consent that was granted. It wasn't, because it wasn't required. I mean, it was granted before the 2014 local plan was adopted, and certainly before any mention of, and certainly before the NPPF and the current requirement to get biodiversity net gain. So you're not starting with a fresh slate. You're starting from a position where a lot of these issues have actually been established and addressed previously, and we're trying to get to a point where it's as good a fit as it can be with the issues that we're looking at now. I think we have, our view as officers is that we've got as far as we possibly can in getting those biodiversity measures here.
Could it then be noted that I would like to request plan to get together with the applicant again in an informal discussion to see if we can push that further, given that we're in a very different time now?
We can note that, yeah, and we can obviously, yeah, I mean there will be more details in terms of the landscaping that comes forward in this phase and the next phase and in the next phases.
Councillor Button.
Thank you, Chair. It's not a question, it's an answer to Councillor Bergeron, really. On the 10th of November, 2,000 new trees are being planted in Bungus Woods by Friends of West Owen Woods, and there's been thousands of new trees planted on Southern Park since this outline planning permission is given. So we've already re-established a lot of the trees that we're going to lose here anyway, many times over. Thank you.
Councillor Brown.
Thank you. My point relates to biodiversity as well. The question, and I'm pleased to hear about those 2,000 new trees. But I think it's important we look at the application in the context of, on this occasion, we want the housing and we accept some biodiversity loss, and it's not an isolated application, it's one of many, so we absolutely have to bust a gut to replace that biodiversity as best we can. And there's some great things in it. I'm really pleased to see the heat pumps. I'm wondering if we could do a little bit more in terms of green roofs, hedgerows, that kind of thing. So I'd echo the comments that have been made about what more can we do. And to highlight that it is in the context of a biodiversity emergency. And the question before us isn't, are we going to build these houses, but is what's in front of us good enough to meet those needs? And I'm a little bit undecided on that one.
And what was the question?
The question is,
big comment.
The question is, have we considered green roofs and other biodiversity measures? So we've got, what, 20 bird boxes? That doesn't seem like very much to me. So the question might be, what more can we do?
In terms of the design approach to the houses that are provided, I think the approach that was taken was to try and sort of provide something that's similar to the properties that have been built on the earlier phases, keeping them north of the tree belt. And my understanding is that, you know, they are quite energy efficient dwellings in terms of their taking the fabric first approach and air tightness, etc., all that sort of stuff. In terms of the biodiversity enhancement side of things, yeah, like I say, the application has been updated by a new updated ecological report. The applicant's ecologist has provided some input and suggested that because of the mature tree belt as well that exists and is retained and isn't altered in any way as a result of this application, that the provision of those bird and bat boxes within the some existing trees is the best approach of enhancement. There's also some scrub provision for invertebrates along, so we're leaving those buffer areas alongside the provision of buffer areas alongside the tree belt and then alongside Urban Green Lane for invertebrates. And the provision of swift boxes was a sort of an additional requirement that we asked the applicant to make, and they sort of kindly agreed to that, to get some provision within the buildings itself as well. And that was considered to be sufficient by the applicant's ecologist based on the sort of the impact of the development on this phase.
Sorry, again, just to add to that, paragraph 86 of the report on page 34, it kind of covers the detail, and as well as the things that Sarah's mentioned, there's also the scope within the planting scheme. You mentioned hedgerows and things. It does indicate that the landscaping scheme will include the wildflower areas and hedges and the trees that we've talked about as well. So we have considered the points that you raised, actually.
Okay, we'll move. Another question, Councillor.
I just want to go back to what Councillor Giles was saying about the architectural liaison, the Norfolk Police comments. I feel very uncomfortable with asking for somebody's opinion, they give it, and then you say, we're not going to take any notice of it, and actually it's your job to find more resources. And it's just really, I don't know who wrote paragraph 33. Norfolk and Stanley have the responsibility for policing, making Norfolk a safe place where people want to live, work and travel and invest. And the key to providing sustainable communities that are safe and accessible so that crime and disorder does not undermine community cohesion. I mean, it just goes, it's saying, well, it's your job as police to do that, and not as planners to try and minimise the opportunity for crime.
We're still on questions,
Yeah,
so that's a good comment again, Councillor, which we could have moved on to by now. Councillor Champion, have you got questions?
I do have a question.
Thank you.
So, this development is on Bonkers Hill. There's going to be future developments going downhill, including the area highlighted on that behind you at the moment. Bonkers Hill is located between the Ware and the Wensum. Currently, we've got a climate emergency with increasing rates of flash flooding occurring. All the photos you showed me, there was a lot of hardscaping. What mitigation has there been made, especially with the removal of trees? You can plant fresh trees, but the permeability that's been used a few times in regards to other terms, but from a geography perspective, permeability of the roots of established trees allows for drainage and for soak away. Have we mitigated for the loss of established trees with soak away? And if we haven't, are the storm drains going directly into the rivers, which would make sense? And if that is the case, is that going to increase flood risks? And when I've been looking through the notes, I know that Anglia Water is very vague, and so I just wanted some clarification on this.
Separate to this application for reserve matters, so we're dealing with the essentially layout, etc., as I set out in the report. Separate to that, there is an application that we have to deal with discharging relevant conditions of the outline planning permission. So the outline planning permission was granted with 40 odd conditions attached to it. Some of those include conditions to do with surface water drainage and foul water drainage. So because they cover the whole of the site and their sort of cohesive, extensive arrangement is required to deal with it rather than on a phase-by-phase basis. That part of that application, we've been in consultation with Anglian Water and the lead local flood authority, and conversations are still taking place about that. So there was a flood risk assessment provided at the outline application stage. The surface water from the site, it's a complicated site because as you come down the hill you get into a groundwater source protection zone, and therefore infiltration drainage becomes very problematic because of water quality issues. But the top part of the site has got some provision to provide it. So the buildings are, soakaway drainage is provided for individual private plots. But the rest of the roads, etc., they're all fed into a pipe system that discharges into two lagoons that have already been constructed as part of earlier phases when they built the spine road, and this would connect into that existing agreed arrangement. But the details, like I say, are still being considered as part of the condition discharge, and that will be sort of bottomed out as part of that process. So it would have been, at that initial stage, the flood risk assessment considered, you know, the site, the topography, the fact that it was a greenfield site, and considered it for the up to 1,000 dwellings, and looked at the principle of, you know, covering that with large extents of hard surfacing and how that would be dealt with sufficiently by a drainage system that was then subsequently approved in principle.
If I may just come back to that, then could I just echo the point maybe made by Councillor Graham about the encouraging for green roofs to be maybe included into the application, because it seems to me that this is, you know, it's we need to ensure that, you know, we don't encourage flash flooding occurring. And I appreciate what you said, but I just feel like it's worth saying out loud.
Okay, so now we've gone into discussion now. We will now go into discussion, but before we do that, I'll rule the recommendation. Recommendation is to approve, and we've got second, please. Thank you. Move on. I've got two speakers, Councillor Bergeron and then Councillor Sands.
So I'm obviously excited that we get to the next phase of this development, and I will be voting for this. I think we all know that the developer has got sustainability very high on their agenda, so I hope they've been listening to the comments we've made and maybe hopefully push it a bit further than already committed to the biodiversity net gain, which I think can be achievable overall.
Councillor Sands.
Interesting. For a start, I don't think green roofs are the answer in an urban setting. Large factory roofs and other sorts of things, you know, they can work. But who's going to maintain green roofs on someone's dwelling? Am I going to get up there with my lawnmower and mow the grass on the roof? No, I don't think so. However, this area has been put aside for development since 1974. One of the things which was said, and I have a book here, the planners were conscious of the environment, or their economic pressures limited what they could achieve. The bicycle and bus were intended to dominate the car. Cycleways, walkways and tree belts crisscross this housing area, which is also dotted with children's play areas and is free from through traffic. You drive through, walk through Bothorpe, and it's probably the greenest area in the city. Anyway, any suburb, any of the 13 wards, I defy anyone to find an area that is greener than Bothorpe. It has, it's unbelievable how much green space we have there. how much tree plantation there is, and as Councillor Butler's already said, there is over 2,000 trees to be planted. There's been extensive tree planting in both Southern Park. As has already been outlined, there are provisions for soakways as far as storm drainage goes. The lagoons for road drainage already being put in provision. And as for biodiversity, let me see. We've got bats, fallow deer, muntjac deer, foxes, rabbits, red kites, numerous species of birds, too many for me to list here. It's probably one of the most biodiverse areas in the city. And the Green Council here have a cheek to sort of criticise area of both. We take pride in our part of the city. We take pride in how green it is. We take pride in every aspect of our corner of the city. And as I said, you won't find a greener part of the city anywhere. To quote someone else, one day in the depths of wartime, an open-mouthed Mr. Woods listened in astonishment to his employer. The day will come when these fields will be covered with people and with houses, shops and even industry. And 30 years later that prophecy began to come true. But even then, 30 years ago, when both was first established, the green credentials were put in place then. And it continues to this day. And this development is probably one of the best developments I've seen anywhere in all my experience. One of my majors in geography was urban geography, I might add, and I think this is one of the best developments I have ever seen anywhere. And as far as progressing down the hill, yep, that provision, that land has been put aside for housing since 1974. So get used to it, folks, and it's going to be an excellent example of urban development as it moves down the hill. We have a large park to the north of the three villages of Bowthorpe, between Clover Hill and Gearan Road. We have Bowthorpe Southern Park, we have the Earl Marshes, we have paddocks and horses, goats, pheasants, another variety of wildlife to the west of Bowthorpe. It is, as I said, the greenest area, probably got more open space than anywhere in the city. So I'm really, really disappointed with the comments of some of our colleagues here today. I most certainly will be supporting this application.
Councillor Stupy.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Rather than repeat anything, I'll be brief. I understand that the Greens have to ask the questions that they've asked, but clearly.
Can we just, this is an apolitical committee, can we stop that?
Can we just...
Who's being political? I was criticising your criticism of this development. There's no political comment there.
Can we have no shout across the room, please? Let's get on with a meeting. You should know better, Councillor Bergwijn. Councillor Stewart.
Okay, I'll start again. I understand that some members are interested in bringing up green matters. But clearly, these items have been discussed in previous committees. This is an excellent part of a wider development. And possibly the greenest ward in one of the greenest cities. And if all developments had 68% affordable housing, we'd be in a good place. I'll be voting for.
Yeah, I'm going to be voting for as well. My father was on the first vocal committee when they decided to look at that site completely. So I can remember growing up there, looking at the site, and it was just all fields, and looking at the water tower, and they put a big balloon up to see how high that was going to be, because people were complaining about the height of the water tower, which is still there, matter of fact. And it seems good that I'm now chair of the planning committee, which is still carrying on the great work which is going on in Blackpool. And it is one way Ian Strictly was saying about the affordable houses going on this site. There's a lot going on this site, and we've been waiting for this. There ain't so many going on to the other sites that have been built down here recently. So another 68 is a fantastic bit for residents of the city for not being homeless. We've got Councillor Berger. I didn't know what was coming with discussion or just an argument.
Yeah, I think we should make sure that we're members of the planning committee, not members of the political party as we sit here, and we have discussed the planning application in front of us, which has matters around biodiversity and biomass raised. So I think it was well within our remit and important that we discuss this.
Perhaps you can bring out the constitution of the party or something like that.
Chairman,
Okay.
Chairman, I agree with him.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
It's matter of clarification.
Yeah. Okay. Pete, Councillor Pete. My God, where'd that go to?
Just to let go of what Councillor Sands said about Beaufort, my sister used to live in Beaufort over 30 years ago and she moved up to York. She came down a few years ago to visit me and I took her around Beaufort and she reckoned, you know, it really does look nice down there. The way they designed it, all the roads with the fields around it and everything. And just to let go on that actually.
Councillor Bowen?
Yes, I think possibly some of the concerns raised today are because the outline planning was sent in 2013 and a lot has happened. Unprecedented changes have happened and all we're trying to do is sort of just, recognise that things have changed and try to make it as best as it can be. And it is quite, acceptable for us to do that, I think. And yes, we all, I'm sure, welcome the housing, but we want to be sure that it is as good as it can be in the environment, and the environment's as good as it can be. I'm pleased to see that there's the basis for electric vehicle charging, and then it's up to each individual house, presumably, whether they pay for the pods or not, if the actual infrastructure is in there. That's very much cheaper than having it added on at a later date. That's that's a plus. I'm actually quite unhappy about whether or not there's enough provision for the maintenance of the green areas and the trees, because they are very costly over the years. They become more and more expensive. But perhaps that's something that I ought to take up with our housing department. But generally, very much in favour, and anything that the developer can do to improve things as in terms of biodiversity as they go along, I think will be very welcome. And I'm sure that people will be very happy living here. It's less dense than some of the other parts, and it's got an elevated position that does give wonderful views over the Aire Valley. And so, but this is very precious land. I mean, you can only develop it once, and we want to make the development the best it can be. Thank you.
Councillor Cherry.
I just wanted to encourage any other geographers in the room, as a geographer myself, a geography teacher, if they want to discuss flood management and up-to-date, knowledge on these sort of topics. I'll be more than happy to take time out of my day, to do that. And to say that it's encouraging that there's such enthusiasm to plant trees among some of my colleagues here. So that's really, I find that fantastic. I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
I think I plant all the trees every day with the drink I drink. They plant them every time I drink a pipe. So, I do my business every day. If there's no one else wish to comment on the application, all those in favour, please show. That's unanimous. Thank you very much. That's been approved. Do anyone want a quick break or not? Can I just apologise? We're going to have a 5-10 minute break. Thank you. thank you very much for that short break. We'll move on now to the rest of the application. There's only one left, 4B. There's 170 Yellowpaint Road. I'll ask Catherine if she can take us through the report. Thank you.
Thank you. So this application is, as the Chair just said, for 170 Unpaint Road. The property at the moment is one dwelling, and the proposal is to split it into 2 dwellings. The site is a corner plot, so it's relatively large in terms of the neighbouring terrace dwellings. It's an end terrace, and it fronts onto 3 different roads. And this is aerial view. You can see there's the Eating Cottage pub to the southwest, and then the roads that it fronts onto is Mount Pleasant to the southwest, onto Unpaint Road, onto Berry Street. You could say that the principal elevation is facing Unpaint Road. That's where the front door is at the moment, and the porch. The proposal originally included a new direct access onto Unpaint Road to serve both new dwellings. However, following negotiation, plans were revised and the new access was removed from the scheme. The revised plans were then reconsulted and re-advertised as well. So this is the current site plan. The line in the middle is a garden wall, and as you can see around the outside there's brick walls as well, with 2 pedestrian accesses, one onto Unpaint Road and one onto Mount Pleasant. The section, square section to the right of the screen is currently a garage that gains access from Mount Pleasant. The proposal would move the boundary wall along the centre slightly. It would ultimately have 2 pedestrian accesses onto Unpaint Road, closing out the original one, retain the pedestrian access from Mount Pleasant, introduce a new pedestrian access from Berry Street, and the current garage would be converted. So the existing property is a 3-bedroom dwelling. As you can see on the ground floor, the garage is to the right. So the proposal would divide it approximately in half. One property would be 2 bedrooms, and the other would be 2, potentially 3 bedrooms, depending on future occupiers' use of the rooms downstairs or use of the room downstairs. The existing garage would be converted into an open plan kitchen, diner, living room. It would essentially use the existing building, creating a very small extension in the corner of, I think, something like 2 square metres. These are both the proposed elevations and the existing elevations. So as you can see, the existing garage is single pitch and mono pitch going towards Unpaint Road, and the proposal would increase the overall height slightly and have a flat roof. And then to the front there would be large 5-hole doors serving the new open plan kitchen, living, dining area. A new front door, excuse me. A new front door is proposed where there's existing window. The width wouldn't change with the opening, it would literally just get, the opening would be increased to the bottom. No other external changes are really proposed apart from potentially removing the chimney stack. There are 2 chimney stacks at the moment. The more historic one is to the left as you look at the property, and the one to the right is the one that may be removed, but that's dependent upon the condition once they get up and have a proper look at the chimney. The proposed pedestrian access is shown here on Tyneside Road. There are proposed works to the existing boundary walls. It's understood that some of the walls may be increased in height. The details of this would be conditioned because of its location. It may impact upon highway safety in terms of cars coming out of the adjacent roads and pulling on Tyneside Road. But the principle of changing and increasing the boundary walls is accepted. So just going through some photos here. This is the property looking on from Berry Street. And this is from Untitled Road, and you can see the dual pitched porch in the centre there, and then the two chimneys. And this is the existing garage, which is to be converted. And a few pictures just close up of the property. This just shows that there's an increase in height from Untitled Road, so you've got steps from the path leading into the garden, and then steps again from the garden leading up to the front door. So this is the boundary wall between, or the wall in the middle of the site at the moment, and you can see just behind the hanging basket the garage. To the right is a relatively large magnolia tree. That's just close up or closer of the garage beyond. So I'll go back a few. So I don't need to make you dizzy. Right, so in terms of any constraints on the site, the property isn't within a conservation area, but it does directly border a conservation area. And so the conservation area is to the southwest and runs along Mount Pleasant. Eaton Cottage, the pub there, is also locally listed. The local retail centre, which I think most of you probably know, there's quite a lot of shops and takeaways and things like that within this part of Untitled Road, is just sort of beyond the property. So see from the image up there, Hong Kong Fusion takeaway. So I believe that takeaway still existing, and there's things like estate agents and a former convenience store within the local area as well. Other than that, the area is predominantly residential, and the majority of dwellings are Victorian terrace design and age. So in terms of the issues, moving to the principle, the proposed subdivision of the property is considered to be acceptable. The area is, as I say, largely Victorian terraces, but several of these are used as HMOs, and several have been split into flats. There are both larger properties in this area and smaller properties, so two-bed dwellings it's considered to be suitable for the character of the area. In terms of design, the property is quite a nice example of a Victorian terrace. There aren't too many changes proposed. Some of the key features like the sash windows and the lintels are all to be retained. The alterations to the side sort of garage section would remain subordinate to the dwelling. Scroll through to the proposed elevations. And the side section would still not encroach upon the front elevation at all, so it would be retained as subordinate. A proposed potting shed is, sorry, going the wrong way. So there's a proposed potting shed in the corner, which would be hidden from the boundary by the boundary walls, so in that front section. The magnolia tree in the front is proposed to be removed. This is considered to have a positive contribution to the conservation area, although the tree itself isn't protected by a TPO or by the fact that it's in a conservation area. Its contribution in terms of amenity to the area and the settlement conservation is good enough to justify asking for replacement planting. The applicant has indicated that he's happy to do this. He's proposed 2 types of trees, but we feel that the types aren't appropriate. So again, looking at conditioning the exact details without conditioning the impact upon the conservation area is considered acceptable. In terms of amenity, the use as a dwelling is clearly an established use. Increasing this to 2 dwellings isn't considered to have a significant impact. The future occupiers would have sufficient internal space. Both properties meet the technical housing standards. They both have their own private amenity space. So in terms of the impact, amenity is also considered acceptable. Now the proposal doesn't include a new vehicle access. The impact in terms of transport is considered acceptable. There's enough space for both dwellings to have their own refuse and cycle storage. And there's enough space there to accommodate sort of sufficient amenity area. Discussions have been had with the highways officers about permit parking. The property at the moment has a permit pass, and one of the dwellings would retain this, and the other dwelling wouldn't be eligible as a new dwelling. However, given that the public transport available in this area is relatively good, and it's so close to a local retail centre, car-free property here is considered acceptable. This moves me on to the updates. Proposal is recommended for approval. There's a list of conditions in the report, and there's one proposed change to this. Condition 7 in the report is listed as construction method statement. This is because there are concerns that during the construction phase there might be negative impact upon the flow of traffic along particularly Untitled Road, and also highway safety if there are, for instance, vans or lorries delivering things like bricks and obstructing the flow of traffic, particularly at peak times. And so condition 7 at the applicant's request is going to be changed to a condition which will impose restrictions in terms of being only being able to unload and load at certain times of the day and not on Untitled Road, which addresses the highways officer's concerns. So the application has been brought to committee because it received 2 objections, and we are recommending approval.
Thank you very much for that, Captain. We'll move on to questions. Any questions, Councillor Subi and Councillor Love?
Thank you, Chair. I've just got a question about why it's come to committee, what criteria was used, because other domestic items have not come to committee.
Although it is existing house, because the proposal is to create a new house, it's then a full application. So if it was just a householder extension, it wouldn't be eligible, but because it's a full application, so it meets the criteria in terms of delegation.
Okay, thank you for that. Can we have a look at the tree? Do you have any of the pictures that you've got of the
sorry, the tree?
The tree in it, and just to have a look at that, please.
Sorry, let me.
Are you able to identify the trees from that photo? Because I'm not familiar with which one it is.
That's on the left.
Sorry, it is. That's not.
That's on the left. The big one on the left and the one on the right. That's the Mongolian tree, though.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Therefore, we've replaced some planting. Is it possible to condition a tree of a reasonable size that will reach a similar size in a fairly short time?
The tree officers recommended several different species. Just have a quick look what they were. So he's recommended several, including potentially hawthorn or a pear tree. So the concern with the magnolia tree at the moment, although it looks good and clearly has a benefit, it's still growing, and so it would compete unduly with the dwelling, and it's basically too big for the site. So the tree officer is recommending species that wouldn't compete but would still have that presence.
Okay, so if there was no application for a development here, would the landowner be able to remove that tree anyway? Okay, thank you.
Yes, they would do.
Thank you. And just one more question relating to the bespoke condition. Have you set timings, or are likely to be timings? Or was that not set yet?
Yes, the provisional timings, so I should have this in front of me, I believe are at 7 o'clock to 9:30 in the morning to miss the initial rush hour, and then 4:30, I think 7 o'clock again in the evenings, Monday to Saturday. So it's just that sort of morning and afternoon slots.
Councillor?
Yes, I'm glad that that condition is there because Untitled is very busy. But Mount Pleasant round the corner is just as busy, and there's parking next door to the park. So if anything parks round the corner, you're actually blocking the road. And, well, I mean, it's a very difficult one, but presumably they will be allowed to park round the corner at any time. But not on that road? Is that the area?
There are current restrictions in place already. So there's a double yellow line immediately against the property as you go onto Mount Pleasant. Yeah. And then, as you rightly say, opposite there, outside the pub, there's some parking. The Norfolk County Council Streetworks team, they have the ability to issue permits for construction vehicles. They also have the ability to block off some existing parking for a certain amount of time. So if the applicant needed to or wanted to, they could contact them directly and ask for that permission, and that would be a set amount of days that would be allowed, or potentially be allowed. That would be up to them.
So to be clear, there's no parking on Unbank Road at those particular times.
There's a double yellow line on Unflack Road anyway, but this is sort of so what I'm saying there is so got to a strange screen here.
Can I just step in? Yeah. I just want to reiterate that the amount of actual development happening here is very limited, and many of these types of developments would be able to happen under permitted development rights or under householder applications where we wouldn't necessarily control construction traffic. So just want to be careful about us getting too involved in that. I understand it's a busy area, but it's something that we wouldn't normally control for such a small development.
There was no more questions. We'll move on to discussions, and I'll move the recommendation. The recommendation is to approve. Thank you, Sally, for seconding. Any discussion? Anybody? Councillor Stu.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think the issues that were raised by the objectors have been largely largely dealt with. Actually, I quite like this. It's a clever use of this site. Where it's spotted the potential. It's a good use. When I saw that this was for sale, I thought this was likely to be an HMO because it could be divided into 6 separate bedrooms and actually 2 houses with potential for a couple of families. It's not going to be a student accommodation, so potential for a couple of families is good. Someone will be voting in favour.
Yeah, I actually like this as well. Like there's one house already there, and the other bit was on the side, but you then turn it into another house. I did say at our pre-meeting, I could have fancied that one myself when next door to the pub. But I understand that the tenant has moved into that one and getting rid of the other one, I understand. Whatever, so that's a bit of a shame. But I did go past there this morning down Alpine Road. When you drive down, that magnolia tree just blocks the view to both properties. You cannot see anything until you're near our opposite the gate to go in. So pulling that tree down and sort that garden, because there's hardly any garden you could walk in or sit in or do anything, and the moment would be an improvement, I believe. So I know it's a big tree gone down again, but you did ask to put an oak tree in, but we're actually turning an oak tree down, so you're too big. And I thought, that's the first time I've heard of turning an oak tree down in a conservation area, but I see the tree officer must know best. So it seems a good scheme, and I hope they do get started and move in. Councillor.
Yeah, sorry to disagree with you, Chair, but that is a magnificent magnolia tree. It's been there for years, and it is absolutely beautiful when it's in flower in the spring. It's a shame it's going, because once it's gone, it will reveal the flat roof, and I think that it's a poor design. I mean, if they were going to create 2 dwellings, at least make it a 2-storey dwelling, but a huge flat roof is exposed, and it won't look good on the road, I'm afraid. They could have made more of it and put an extension on, a 2-storey extension, and that would have really made it look very good. But I think pulling the tree down, exposing this, what was a garage, which is a single, a flat roof garage, I don't think it would look very good at all. And I'm a bit disappointed that we couldn't have better quality. But there we are. But it is a shame that the tree would go. It's absolutely magnificent in the street scene, as they say.
Councillor Saints.
Yeah, I agree. Magnolia trees are my favourite, particularly when they're in blossom. Just a quick question. It's not part of this planning application, but there would be no barrier to whoever lives in the house with the former garage at some future date applying to put up a story on, provided the foundations could take it, is it?
No, none that I'm aware of.
And the garage was there to pull through. Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. I agree that the tree is actually a real benefit to the area, and which is why I hoped that it would be replaced with something quite substantial. But I'd just like the committee to take note. The Chair said the tree officer knows best.
If there's no more discussion, we'll straight to the vote. All those in favour, please show.
Chair, it will be a recorded vote. That's Councillor Champion voting in favour, Councillor Driver, Councillor Bergeline, Councillor Peake, Councillor Giles, Councillor Button, Councillor Sands, Councillor Maxwell, Councillor Stoopsley, and Councillor Gray.
All those against?
Councillor Lovett voting against.
Thank you. So that no extensions. That application has been approved. Thank you. Thank you very much for everyone turning up. Hope to see you again in 4 weeks' time.